The courtroom was tense, filled with murmurs as the judge tapped his gavel, calling for silence. Two white police officers stood confidently before him, their lawyers speaking with an air of certainty. Across from them sat David Carter, a composed black man in a tailored suit, his face betraying no emotion. The case seemed simple, at least in the judge's eyes. The officers had claimed they arrested David for suspicious behavior outside a high-end restaurant. They insisted that he was uncooperative, refused to show ID, and resisted arrest, forcing them to detain him. David, however, knew the truth. He had simply been waiting for his car at the valet stand after dinner when the officers approached him aggressively, demanding identification without reason. When he calmly asked why he was being questioned, they deemed his tone hostile and, without warning, shoved him against a police car, cuffing him in front of onlookers. The humiliation of that moment still burned inside him. But now, sitting in court, he had something else on his mind, the judge's blatant bias. Throughout the proceedings, it became increasingly clear that the judge had no intention of ruling in David's favor. Whenever his lawyer presented evidence, surveillance footage showing David peacefully complying, the judge barely glanced at it before dismissing it as inconclusive. But when the officers recounted their version of events, the judge nodded along, barely concealing his agreement. It was obvious this courtroom was a stage, and the verdict had been decided before the trial even began. When the officer's lawyer finished his closing remarks, the judge exhaled, already reaching for his gavel. Given the officer's testimony and lack of sufficient contradictory evidence, I see no reason to pursue this case further. I am inclined to dismiss all charges against the defendants. The officers smirked. Their lawyer gave a satisfied nod. They thought they had one. But then David stood up. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. "Before you make that ruling, I believe it's important for the court to understand exactly who I am." The judge let out a sigh of annoyance. "Mr. Carter, I've heard your side." "No, Your Honor," David interrupted smoothly, taking a step forward. "You've heard what you wanted to hear. But now you're going to hear the truth." The room fell silent. Even the officers, who had been so smug just moments ago, now shifted uncomfortably. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge, flipping it open for everyone to see. "My name is David Carter. I am a U.S. attorney with the Department of Justice." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge's eyes widened. The officers froze, their faces draining of color. David continued, his voice carrying a new weight. "I specialize in prosecuting civil rights violations, particularly those involving law enforcement misconduct. That means I not only know the law inside and out, but I also have the authority to take this case far beyond this courtroom." He let his words settle, his gaze never leaving the judge. "So, before you dismiss this case, Your Honor, I strongly advise you to reconsider. Because if justice isn't served here today, I guarantee it will be served at the federal level." The judge, who had been so confident moments ago, suddenly looked pale. His fingers twitched as he adjusted his glasses. He knew exactly what this meant. If he ignored David's case now, he himself could face scrutiny for judicial bias. His reputation, his entire career, could be on the line. Clearing his throat, the judge stole a nervous glance at the officers, who were no longer smirking. One of them shifted, his jaw tightening as if realizing the full weight of what had just happened. Their lawyer fumbled with his notes, suddenly looking much less sure of himself. After a long, tense pause, the judge finally spoke, his voice not nearly as steady as before. "Upon further review of the evidence," he said carefully, "this court finds reason to proceed with a full investigation into the defendant's conduct." He cleared his throat again. "The motion to dismiss is denied." The officers stiffened. Their lawyer immediately jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this case is moving forward," the judge said sharply, cutting him off. "Court is adjourned." He slammed his gavel down, his decision final. As the courtroom emptied, the two officers hurried out, their earlier confidence completely shattered. Their lawyer trailed behind them, whispering frantically. The judge, still looking unsettled, left quickly, avoiding David's gaze. David, however, stood tall. He hadn't just fought for himself today. He had exposed a corrupt system in real time. And thanks to his position, he had the power to ensure these officers, and maybe even the judge, faced real consequences. This wasn't just about one courtroom or one case. It was about setting a precedent, about showing that no matter how deeply rooted corruption might be, there were still those willing to fight against it. He knew this victory would echo beyond these walls, reaching others who had suffered injustices in silence. Today was proof that the system could be challenged, and he intended to see that challenge through to the very end. This wasn't just about his case anymore. It was about every case like his that had been unjustly dismissed before. Every person who had been silenced, humiliated, and denied justice. It was about those who had walked away with their dignity stripped, unable to fight back against a system that saw them as nothing more than statistics. But now there was hope. Now the silence was being broken, and the fight for justice had a voice that refused to be ignored. This was only the beginning of a movement that demanded change, a movement that David was determined to lead. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, the system had been put on notice. Accountability was no longer optional. Today, the tide had turned. Today, David had cracked the armor of that system, and he had no intention of stopping here. He would push forward, ensure accountability, and demand systemic change. And now he had the power to make sure it never happened again. Not to him, not to anyone else. As David gathered his things, the young black woman approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, her voice carrying both admiration and pain. "I just wanted to say thank you. I've seen too many cases like this, too many times where justice was never served. Seeing you stand up today, it gives people like me hope. It shows us that change is possible, that someone is willing to fight for us." David studied her face, seeing the weight of past injustices reflected in her eyes. He nodded, offering a small but reassuring smile. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's just the beginning. We're going to keep fighting. We won't stop until justice isn't just an exception, but the standard." The woman exhaled, her expression shifting from pain to determination. "Then I'll be watching. And I'll be ready to stand, too." David watched as she walked away, realizing the impact of this moment stretched beyond just this case. It was bigger than him. It was about inspiring others to believe in the fight, to believe in justice. And that was exactly what he intended to do. He turned to leave, but before stepping out of the courtroom, he glanced back at the judge's empty chair. This was just one battle, but the war for justice was far from over. Walking out of the courthouse, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "This is Carter," he said firmly. "We need to move forward with a federal civil rights investigation, and I want every case connected to these officers on my desk by tomorrow." As he stepped into the bright afternoon sun, he knew one thing for certain. Change was coming, and he was going to lead the charge.